This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is entitled The Middle East Since 1918, Part 2. In the 1950s and 1960s, many in the Middle East turned to Arab nationalism as a way to combat Western imperialism. The most important figure in Arab nationalism in the 1950s and 1960s was Gamal Abdel Nasser, who lived from 1918 to 1970. Nasser was the ruler of Egypt from 1956 until his death in 1970. And he was a dynamic figure in the Arab world, and Egypt has the largest population in the Arab world. Nasser promoted a pan-Arab movement, and he attempted to unify Arab states. And Egypt and Syria actually briefly did so. Nasser favored non-alignment, a neutral position in the Cold War between the Soviet Union on the one hand and the United States on the other. Nasser wanted to develop Egypt, and he had the Aswan Dam built along the Nile River in southern Egypt to generate hydroelectricity and help industrialize Egypt. Egypt was also home to the Suez Canal, which was strategically important for world trade and had been under British oversight since the late 19th century. In 1956, Nasser moved to nationalize the Suez Canal, to place it under direct control of the Egyptian government. And this greatly alarmed the British, French, and Israelis, who in 1956 jointly intervened in Egypt and together attacked Egypt. Now, under the leadership of President Dwight Eisenhower, the American government feared the Suez crisis might lead to a world war with the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower, because of that, successfully pressured the British to withdraw, with the French and Israelis doing the same shortly after. The Suez crisis is widely seen as a moment in which the British became a second-rate power compared to the United States, because the British had to basically respect American wishes and withdraw in what was seen in the world as more or less a humiliating fashion. In the end, Egypt retained control of the Suez Canal over the objections of the British, French, and Israelis. And in a sense, in the 1956 Suez crisis, the Egyptians under Nasser successfully resisted Western imperialism. But they only did so due to the diplomatic involvement of a newly dominant power in the West, the United States. In addition to Nasser, successful pan-Arab parties called Ba'ath parties also took over the governments of Syria under the Assad family and in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And both Syria and Iraq, led by the Assad family and Saddam Hussein, these Ba'ath parties in both countries, based their power claims on Arab nationalism. However, Nasser's Egypt and the pan-Arab movement failed to defeat Israel in a series of wars, all that led to humiliating Arab defeats in 1967 and 1973. Even an Arab oil embargo in the 1970s did not work to break Israel. Egypt and Israel finally signed a peace treaty that American President Jimmy Carter brokered in 1979. However, tensions and land disputes between Israel and Arab Palestinians persist to this day. And there have been a number of conflicts that have propped up between Israel and the Palestinians since the 1980s. In addition, governments in the Middle East, either military dictatorships or monarchs, have often been oppressive towards their peoples since 1945, in stark contrast to Israel's democracy. Furthermore, despite tremendous oil resources, Middle Eastern nations failed to industrialize. Economic conditions, including chronic unemployment, have been major problems in many Middle Eastern countries since 1945. Oil has allowed elites in the Middle East, for instance, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, to live lavish lives. But for the most part, oil has not been, these elites have not used their oil resources to invest and industrialize and diversify their economies, reforms that would benefit the majority of the people. By way of comparison, East Asian nations, who have no oil whatsoever, have industrialized. To take one prominent example, South Korea went from being a poor third world nation at the end of the Korean War in the 1950s to a fully industrialized first world nation today. And nothing on this scale has happened in the Middle East, where oil revenues have been spent to subsidize the lifestyle of lavish, wealthy elites. And this can be compared to the way that the Spanish spent much of their huge silver findings in the Americas in the 16th century. As oil deposits in the Middle East will eventually run out, a wealthy emir in Dubai once remarked that this will mean that, as he put it, my grandfather rode a camel, my father rode a camel, I drive a Mercedes, my son drives a Land Rover, his son will drive a Land Rover, but his son will ride a camel. In other words, the oil wealth will eventually run out and the lavish lifestyle of the elites will run out with it. Now this brings me to the final theme of these two videos on the Middle East since 1918, namely the role of religion, and especially Islam in the Middle East since 1918. The failure of the Pan-Arab movement, as well as political oppression in many regimes and continued economic problems, has led to widespread discontent in the Middle East, particularly among ordinary people. Also, since 1945, some Muslims see the influence of Western popular culture and dress as affronts to their culture and as a danger to their way of life. In the 1970s, Western influence was so strong that women in some countries, such as Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, wore modern Western clothing in public, including in some cases miniskirts, something that conservative Muslims found incredibly shocking in their own countries. As a result of this, many Muslims in the Middle East since the 1960s have turned to Islamic movements that seek to promote a revival of a very conservative or fundamentalist form of Islam, as well as politicized Islamic movements. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood has been a powerful force along these lines. As a radical Muslim group, the Muslim Brotherhood has existed in Egypt since the 1920s. In the 1950s, the Muslim Brotherhood even attempted to assassinate Nasser, who they viewed as too secular. Nasser correspondingly cracked down on them for this. In the 1980s and 1990s, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak also saw the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat and cracked down on them again, with many of their leaders ending up in prison. But the Muslim Brotherhood remained popular with students and with the poor, and they had a large underground following in Egypt. In 2010, in what was called the Arab Spring, a pro-democratic movement that began in Tunisia in 2010 swept across much of the Middle East. The Arab Spring led to pro-democracy protests in countries as diverse as Libya, Syria, and Egypt. And they sparked a great deal of hope until pro-democracy movements were mostly repressed by 2012. In Egypt, the Arab Spring led to massive protests and street violence that brought down the government of Hosni Mubarak in February 2011. The Muslim Brotherhood, in turn, would take power in June of 2011 after winning elections. However, the Egyptian military, which had long been part of the politics of Egypt, feared that the Muslim Brotherhood would impose a strict Islamic-style constitution that would grant vast powers to the Muslim Brotherhood itself, and particularly its leader, Mohammed Morsi, and they feared that the Muslim Brotherhood would repress those who did not adhere to the strict conservative form of Islam preached by the Muslim Brotherhood. So in July 2013, the Egyptian military overthrew Morsi and imposed military rule, kicking the Muslim Brotherhood out of power. Now, the role of radical Islam in politics was not just important in Egypt, but also Iran. Iran had long been ruled by a king or a shah. In the 1970s, the Shah was considered a corrupt ruler and a lax Muslim. In 1979, Iran experienced an Islamic revolution led by the cleric, the Ayatollah Khomeini. The Iranian state, under this Islamic revolution, became a strict Shia state that cracked down on Western influence, including forcing women to wear much more conservative clothing. And this is a move that was copied widespread across the Middle East. So women have in many, many countries moved to much more conservative clothing since the 1970s. One of the hallmarks of radical Islamic movements and regimes is the imposition of more conservative clothing on women. And this is a part of policing their bodies and their behavior, and in the view of these Islamic radicals, of reviving Islam and fighting Western cultural imperialism. For its part, because of the Islamic Revolution, Iran promoted Shia Islam in the Middle East, and it became an enemy of the United States after holding members of the American embassy hostage in 1979. Likewise, Iran was hostile to Israel and Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia increasingly becoming the champion of Sunni Islam in the Middle East. Iran also came to fight an extremely bloody war over territory with Iraq between 1980 and 1988. Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, would then, after finally concluding a peace with Iran, invade the small nation of Kuwait in a bid to annex it in 1990. But Saddam Hussein was then defeated and kicked out of Kuwait in a humiliating fashion by an American-led coalition in 1991. And this war against Saddam Hussein, led by the American coalition in 1991, has been called Operation Desert Storm. And it was a very successful military campaign and a humiliating defeat for Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Now, for its part, Saudi Arabia has spent a great deal of money to promote Wahhabism, both in the Middle East and worldwide. Wahhabism is a strict puritanical form of Sunni Islam. However, this promotion of Wahhabism hasn't always gone well for Saudi Arabia. Radical Islamic movements, such as Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, did not see the Saudis as pure enough and sought to overthrow them, particularly for their alliance with the United States against Iraq. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda, which came to see the United States as an enemy and a Western imperialist for stationing troops in Saudi Arabia, launched terrorist attacks on the United States in New York City and Washington, D.C. This ultimately resulted in the American invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 to go after Al-Qaeda, and of Iraq in 2003, which supposedly had weapons of mass destruction. Now, the so-called neoconservatives in the American government who pushed for the Iraq War also said that the Iraq War would help democratize the Middle East. Unfortunately, the Iraq War was a bloody disaster. It was widely seen in the Middle East as yet another example of Western imperialism, with Americans as unwanted foreign occupiers of Iraq. And American intervention in Iraq destabilized the country, resulting in widespread fighting between American forces and Iraqis, as well as fighting between the different ethnic and religious groups in Iraq itself, particularly Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, as well as the Kurdish minority. And this fighting was particularly bitter among Iraqis themselves. Iraq did have a Christian minority, about 1.4 million people, prior to 2003. And Christians in Iraq, during the Iraq War and all the fighting between Iraqis themselves, faced horrible persecution after Saddam Hussein had fell. Saddam Hussein had protected the Christian minority in Iraq. The plight of Iraqi Christians is illustrative of Christians in the Middle East. And the 20th century has not been kind to religious minorities in the Middle East, such as Christians. In 1900, Christians made up roughly 20% of the population in the Middle East. Due to lower birth rates, immigration, and persecution, that percentage today is now down to only 5% of the population in the Middle East. During fighting in Iraq alone, the Christian population fell from 1.4 million in 2003 down to under 400,000 in 2016. Now, American forces withdrew from Iraq in 2011, but violence has only continued, and American forces were sent back again in 2014. Now, the reason for this was because that neighboring Syria also fell into civil war in 2011, with the government forces of dictator Bashar al-Assad fighting Islamic radicals. The Syrian civil war has led to hundreds of thousands of Syrians fleeing their country, and many, many deaths as well. This has resulted in a Syrian refugee crisis that has rocked Turkey and Europe since 2011, with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people leaving. The most extreme radical Islamic group fighting in Syria against the Syrian government has been known as the Islamic State, or ISIS. ISIS is also known as Daesh in Arabic. ISIS is a radical Islamic Sunni group based on Wahhabism. Indeed, when ISIS first got started, the religious textbooks they used were identical to those used in Saudi Arabia itself. From 2014 into 2017, ISIS carved out a state of its own in much of the Middle East that consisted of parts of Syria, where it started fighting against the Syrian government, and in nearby Iraq, which had been weakened from its own civil war. ISIS proclaimed a new caliphate, calling Muslims worldwide to rally to it. But ISIS rule was very brutal, including mass executions, such as beheadings, ethnic cleansing, destruction of cultural sites, and sexual slavery of women. ISIS was also known for suicide bombings that killed many civilians in countries such as Tunisia, Turkey, Belgium, Britain, and France. Syrian and Kurdish forces, backed by Russia and the United States respectively, went on the offensive against ISIS in 2015, resulting in almost all of ISIS's territories lost by 2017. ISIS is still around, but is a much smaller group than it was when it first got going. Now, as with Syria, Libya fell into civil war in 2011 as part of the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And this civil war ultimately resulted in the death of Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi after U.S. military intervention. But the civil war has continued, and just like Syria and Iraq, Libya is in chaos today. Meanwhile, tensions between Sunni Muslims, led by Saudi Arabia, and Shia Muslims, led by Iran, continues. Saudi Arabia has fought a brutal war in neighboring Yemen since 2015 in a bid to root out Shia forces there. Likewise, Iran has backed Shia forces, who have fought in wars in Syria and Iraq. Now, these sort of conflicts, which have a strong Sunni Muslim versus Shia Muslim dimension, continue to this day. Let's draw some conclusions. The modern Middle East is an incredibly complicated region and one filled with many conflicts. The role of Western imperialism, the importance of nationalism and ethnic tensions, and the role of religion, especially Islam, all loom large in these conflicts since 1918. In many ways, this is because the Islamic world is a civilization in crisis, one that has not caught up with the West, and one that struggles with feeling humiliated by what it considers inferior Western infidels, at least from their religious point of view. None of the ways that Middle Eastern nations have sought to remedy these problems have worked today. And at present, the Middle East is plagued with economic problems for the masses and repressive regimes. With the exception of Israel and Turkey, governments in the Middle East are not democratic. And in recent years, Turkey has increasingly moved away from democracy itself. The Middle East is also racked by internal wars that don't have any end in sight. Certainly, continued conflict is not inevitable, and the Middle East could rebound. In either case, predicting the future is a tricky business for historians, so I won't try, especially with a region as complicated as the Middle East. And I'll stop on this observation. Thanks for watching.